What's on your radar, Ryan?
So we passed from one epoch of the Biden administration to another last Sunday with this pronouncement from on high. And by on high, I mean on Fox News Sunday.
I've always said this, Brett. If I can't go home and explain it to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it. And I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no.
Manchin's phrasing there is interesting. He's tried so hard. He's done everything humanly possible he can to try to get to yes. And you know what? He actually has some reasonable objections. He doesn't like that some of the programs, like the child tax credit and universal pre-K and child care subsidies, are paid for with tax increases that are measured over a 10-year period, but the programs don't go more than a year or two. That means Congress will have to come back and extend them, and when they do, if they want to continue having them paid for, they'll have to find new taxes. Now, of course, we're setting aside the fact that they don't actually need to be paid for, but using Manchin's frame, which is the frame Washington adopted for this bill, he's not wrong. Yet Manchin still had an easy way to get to yes, and that would be by saying yes. There's nothing stopping him from saying, look, these are good programs, extend them for 10 years, but pay for them. And there's an easy way to do that. You just turn up the dial a notch or two on corporate tax rates and individual rates for the rich, and you're there. Throw in a billionaire's tax for fun, which he says he supports. Now, Kyrsten Sinema might object, but at this point, it's unlikely she'd walk as the lone holdout. So a $3 trillion deal, led and negotiated by Joe Manchin, wouldn't just save Joe Biden's presidency and make millions of people's lives less difficult. It would catapult Manchin to the front of the presidential pack immediately. Now, the fact that the scenario I just laid out for you is absurd is a perfect window into how small are the imaginations of so many of our top political figures today. So last week at The Intercept, I noted that there are actually striking parallels between LBJ and Joe Manchin, and some huge differences. Consider this. When Lyndon Johnson took over leadership of the Senate Democratic Caucus in 1953, anybody who suggested he would one day become the most consequential elected champion of civil rights in nearly 100 years would have been laughed out of the smoke-filled room. Yet just a few years later, the protege of the arch-segregationist and white supremacist Senator Richard Russell had broken with his mentor and muscled through the 1957 Civil Rights Act, followed later as president by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, among other sweeping accomplishments. None of that meant Johnson stopped being racist. Rather, he saw where the future was heading. Johnson correctly recognized that segregationist politics had taken him as far as they could, and in order to rise to become a national figure, he needed to flip and become an ally of the civil rights movement. Johnson's political genius lay in his ability to see changing political landscapes and the potential for new coalitions embedded in them, and to shape himself to be the one at the center of that new coalition. Now, Johnson could easily have clung to segregationist politics and continued winning and stealing, by the way, elections that the rest of his life as a steadfast champion of the New Deal. Now, Manchin's capacity to continue winning as a centrist, pro-business Democrat in West Virginia is less assured, but Manchin appears to believe he can continue to hold on to power by making defense of the coal industry, a business in which he's not just a referee but a player, central to his politics. Now, ironically, a path remarkably similar to the one that opened up for LBJ is now laid out for Manchin. But Manchin's narrow view of himself and his potential means that he's unlikely to see it. The imaginary ceiling he sees just above his head is unusual for a senator, most of whom wake up in the morning and see a president in the mirror. It's also unusual for a man who incessantly pines for the glory days of his governorship, when he had genuine executive authority. It's the thing he tells colleagues he misses the most. Yet he doesn't miss it enough to see his path toward gaining it at the national level. If Manchin had more political imagination and more confidence behind his own ambition, he might see that breaking with coal and austerity is his only path out of his own political death spiral. So Democratic primary voters and the media organs through which their news is filtered, like MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, etc., have become increasingly pragmatic in their thinking when it comes to the nomination process. While Republican voters are willing to take a flyer on a wild card like Barry Goldwater or Donald Trump, Democratic voters try to pick a winner. Both black voters and white suburban voters base their own decision-making on their hapless efforts to try to divine which Democratic candidate will be most appealing to those inscrutable white working-class voters who drive election coverage. Democratic primary voters are not terribly good at answering that question. They nominated John Kerry because they thought nobody could besmirch the patriotic credentials of a war hero. But that hasn't diminished their willingness to try. In a world where Joe Manchin saved the Biden presidency and enacted a sweeping Build Back Better Act and followed it up by creating a filibuster carve-out for voting rights, he would immediately surge to the top of the presidential pack, applauded by everyone from Reverend William Barber to AOC to Sunrise to the United Mine Workers. For primary voters wondering what kind of candidate might appeal to voters in the hinterlands, there's no more hinterlandia candidate than a senator from West Virginia. And once a candidate claims a nomination in our polarized era, they're virtually guaranteed a close election. There would, of course, be those crying foul, warning that Manchin can't be trusted and is only cynically pivoting toward his new politics. I'd be loudly among them. And that's just as there were liberal doubters of Johnson's claims of conversion, which came along with his insistence on continuing to drop the N-word in conversation. But in the end, it doesn't matter for the Civil Rights Act whether the signature on it was written with love, nor does it matter to carbon emissions whether they are reduced with warm feelings or in the pursuit of cold ambition. That the comparison you've just read is absurd to contemplate, though, is itself the most revealing evidence of the bankruptcy of Manchin's political imagination. Even Biden, who spent his career as the definition of a defensive, incrementalist moderate, has recognized the moment's possibility. But he can't get there without Manchin, and Manchin, lost in an abandoned mine shaft, can't see his way there. So Joe Manchin for president?
It doesn't seem likely to me. You're trying to paint a future for him. You're trying to paint a picture. You're like, Joe, if you could see what I have envisioned for you, your pivot to progressive politics, and then everyone would love you and you could run for president. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think there's two interesting elements of it. I think the path actually is there. I'm not blowing smoke at Joe Manchin. Like that, in that world, because the bench is so light right now, I think it actually is there. But then it's also fascinating that there's just no way he sees that. That's just not.
He's content to be reelected a senator from West Virginia,
which is less likely. That's a harder path. That's the crazy part.
Yeah.
It will be harder for him to be reelected a senator as a Democrat in West Virginia in 2024 than it would be for him to be elected to the White House if he pivoted towards a big bill and
well, especially because there's just no competition. It is stunning how few options Democrats have coming. It's going to be this hilariously entertaining battle between Kamala and Mayor Pete. That's going to be a popcorn.gif sort of.
Right, Manchin comes in and just sweeps them away.
Yeah, but he's not interested in doing it. He's not interested in doing it. It is different than the Republican side, where everyone on earth, every senator with an R next to their name, wants to run for president. They're not going to win. They'll settle for cable news talking head when they're done.
And in just a generation ago, everyone in the Senate was running for president every 4 years.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Like you name them, they ran for president.
And that's still true for the Republicans.
Times.
That's still true for the Republicans. But the Democrats have a bit more gatekeeping going on somehow. I don't know how your side, the left has not the hard left, but the progressives, liberals have managed to keep that process a little more holy and anointed. Whereas on the right, it's like, no, everyone and their grandmother might as well make a show of it. Might as well try.
Yeah, and we're elevating so many kind of professional class type people to positions of authority that there aren't a lot of people who have connections to working class politics, which is kind of a thing that people want in a presidential candidate. So I think that diminishes the bench.
Do you think Dr. Fauci could win the Democratic Party's presidential nomination if he ran?
Maybe.
I bet he could. Well, up next, Team Rising will join us to discuss the Biden administration's pivot on resuming student loan payments. Stick around for that.